So welcome to the 13th session of ECPS virtual workshop series, We the People and the Future of Democracy, Interdisciplinary Approaches. This online series follows ECPS in-person conference at Oxford University on July 1st to 3rd, 2025, and continues the vital discussions initiated there. My name is Jayka Kolesar. I'm a PhD student at National Chengchi University in Taipei, Taiwan, focusing on populism in East Asia, and I'm currently assisting ECPS on this project. ECPS curates this virtual workshop series to address one of the most pressing questions of our time: how the idea of the people shapes the fate of democracy. By examining how the people can function both as a democratic force and as an instrument of authoritarian consolidation, the series fosters interdisciplinary dialogue to better understand democratic backsliding, resilience, and the evolving future of democracy worldwide. Session 13, Constructing and Deconstructing the People in Theory and Praxis, engages one of the most contested concepts in political thought. Drawing on critical political theory, populism studies, and international advocacy, the panel explores how the people are constructed, mobilized, and institutionalized across diverse contexts, from ethnopolitical dynamics in Bosnia-Herzegovina to the Gilets jaunes assemblies in France and struggles for representation among unrepresented nations. By examining varied populist logics, experiments in direct democracy, and claims to diplomatic inclusion beyond the nation-state, the session underscores the tension between constituent power and constituted authority. It ultimately demonstrates that the people is not a fixed category, but a dynamic political construction, capable of enabling both exclusionary politics and democratic renewal. As a testament to its commitment to knowledge dissemination, ECPS is going to write a workshop report and share the video recording of this event on its website and YouTube channel. And with this, I will introduce the distinguished chair, presenters, and the discussants for today's session. Today's workshop is going to be chaired and moderated by Dr. Leila Aliyeva. Dr. Aliyeva is an associate of REA's Oxford School of Global and Area Studies, and previously a senior Common Room member and academic visitor at St. Anthony College, Oxford University. She holds a PhD from Moscow University. Originally from Azerbaijan, she founded and directed 2 think tanks in Baku and held fellowships at Harvard University, UC Berkeley, at the Kennan Institute, the NATO Defense College, and the IFK in Vienna. Currently, she is analyzing the role of religious identities in transition, as well as comparing the role of opposition in rentier states. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Yasmin Hasanovic to discuss his paper titled Reimagining Populism: Ethnic Dynamics and the Construction of the People in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Dr. Hasanovic is an assistant professor and researcher at the Department for Political Science at the Faculty of Political Science, the University of Sarajevo. His field of research encompasses social and political movements, socialism, post-Yugoslav studies, as well as geopolitics and cyberpolitics. He is also interested in critical political theory, dealing with contemporary debates on democracy and the relationship between activism and the idea of emancipation in contemporary political theory. Our second speaker today will be Dr. Sixtine van Outreij on the topic Institutionalizing the Assembled People. Dr. van Outreij is also a Doctor of Juridical Science candidate at Yale Law School, where she obtained her LLM degree as a BAF Fellow in 2018. She is also a lecturer at Radboud University in the Netherlands, teaching political theory to master students. In 2024, she defended her PhD in law at the Center for Philosophy at the Law of UC Louvain in Belgium, her home country. In her dissertation, she developed normative theory of communalist direct democracy, defending that public power can be exercised by the assembled people at the local level, and analyzed its practice by social movements through qualitative research methods. Neves Fernanda Cancela Sanchez will be the session's third and last presenter to deliver the paper titled Reimagining Diplomatic Representation as a Pillar of Democracy. Cancela Sanchez is a human rights advocate with experience in international advocacy, civil society engagement, and diplomatic affairs. She is a global advocacy officer at UNPO, the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, where she works directly with representatives of minority communities to support their advocacy efforts. Ms. Sanchez has experience in consular affairs, particularly on migration issues, as well as in cooperation for development and youth participation in public policy making. She holds a master's degree in diplomatic studies from the University of Oxford and has a background in diplomatic engagement, focusing on capacity building, advocacy, and international cooperation. Following the presentations, our discussants, Dr. Christopher N. Magno and Dr. Amadeo Variale, will each offer 12 minutes of commentary and feedback. Christopher N. Magno is an associate professor in the Department of Justice Studies and Human Services at Ghana University. He holds a PhD in criminal justice from Indiana University Bloomington, with research focusing on criminology, spatial justice, and state violence. His work examines the epidemiology of violence, the intersection of crime and politics, and the criminalization of poverty and race. He coined the term criminal populism to describe how politicians exploit crime as political capital, a concept explored in his publication Criminal Populism: Crime as a Political Capital in the Philippines and the United States. Dr. Amedeo Variale earned his PhD from the University of East London in March 2024. His research interests focus on contemporary populism and nationalism. During his academic career, Dr. Variale contributed as a research assistant to the development of a significant textbook project on the global resurgence of nationalism titled The New Nationalism in America and Beyond. The book is co-authored by Robert Stretcher and Eric Taylor Woods. He has written for ECPS before, and has also been published by other academic outlets, ranging from the Journal of Dialogue Studies to UEL's Crossing Conceptual Boundaries. Currently, he's also an affiliated researcher for the Center for the Study of Global Nationalisms. As a reminder, a Q&A session will follow the discussants' feedback. Participants may submit questions via the chat box or by raising their virtual hand to ask the questions live. Each presenter will then briefly respond to the questions raised by the participants. And with this, I give the floor to our first speaker.
Leila.
Yes. Yes, thank you so much. I will just cut the my camera. So thank you so much. I feel flattered and honored to be chairing this, I think, excellent panel. In 12 sessions, I think we came eventually to the quite intricate level of analysis and very interrelated to each other. All three are interconnected. All three presentations are interconnected with each other. So it's very intricate analysis of the genesis, evolution, and formation of populism and concepts and images related to that. There are strengths of this project, obvious strength of this project. First of all, multidisciplinary approach, because in post-Cold War era, we increasingly notice that we live in a much complex reality. It's very uncertain, it's very complex, which is a subject of many factors acting on different levels. And that requires quite a much broader approach, multidisciplinary, in particular of such a issue as rise of populism, which is bordering both political affairs, international relations area, social sciences, international relations, political science. All of them are more or less were covered by the initial conference, which was quite outstanding, I would say, last year in Oxford, which took place in Oxford. It also was a comparative because it showed analysis of populism across various geographies. And of course, it proved the adequacy of constructivist approach to analysis of these phenomena, and which would be also confirmed, I think, during our today's discussion. And first of all, that populism and content of populism is the result, is a product, among other things, of interaction. So let me just pass the word to the first presenter, who was already who was already introduced, but it's called Reimagining Populism, Ethnic Dynamics, and the Construction of the People in Bosnia Herzegovina by Jasmine Hasanovic, who is assistant professor at the University of Sarajevo. So could you please start your presentation? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I hope that all of you can hear me and see my presentation. So what I'm going to present today is a different way of thinking about populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina and how we understand the people that are being politically constructed in relation to ethnic politics and to ethnic politics in particular. So as most of you are familiar, the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina ended 30 years ago. And with a peace agreement that was signed, the political system of power sharing among three dominant ethnic groups, Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs, was established. And before the dissolution of the socialist Yugoslavia in the 90s, we had multi-party elections. And in those elections, three national parties of the three main ethnic groups won the majority. And however, while they shared their anti-communist position, on the other side, they had non-negotiable national interests, along with competing territorial claims and visions over Bosnia and Herzegovina, which was and still is a multi-ethnic country. And the aim was to establish national states with ethnically homogenized territories, supported by military assistance from the neighboring countries, Serbia and Croatia in the first place. So the peace agreement established the political institutional framework where the wartime power ratio on the battlefields was basically translated into a post-war parity and consensus, not only in regard to the shared governance, but also adapting and shaping administrative and territorial boundaries that are composed of two entities that hold a lot of constitutional power. We have a federally structured Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina that was a territory controlled by the Army of Republika Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Croatian Council of Defense. And the other entity that is centralized is the entity of Republika Srpska, which was controlled by the army of Republika Srpska. So this is why the dominant literature, when talking about Bosnia and Herzegovina, mostly approaches Bosnia and Herzegovina through those three lenses: ethnic nationalism, power sharing institution, or democratic consolidation. And when it comes to populism, it is also often treated either as ethnic populism or as a thin ideology that is attached to ethno-nationalism. And also another reason why populism is being a lot of attached to ethnicity is because of the term the people in Bosnian, Croat, and Serb language, and that is narod, which basically means the same as ethnicity and civic understanding of the people. So my argument here is a little bit different. Since despite the extensive research on ethnic nationalism, power sharing as an instrument of peace building and conflict management, there is a notable lack in literature examining the mutual relationship among those three concepts with populism. Also, the existing literature usually seeks to demonstrate how populism affects power-sharing systems, often portraying populism as the stabilizing force. But what is less examined is the opposite direction, how those institutional systems generate, influence, and shape populist forms of politics. And also what is important is that the failures of democratic consolidation and governance is not only something that is a result from populism, but it is also something that actively generates populist responses by producing unmet political demands across different levels of society. So that is why I suggest that populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina should not be understood primarily as a specific ideological content, like populism as thin ideology attached to ethno-nationalism, but rather as a political logic that discursively constructs political subjectivities, namely the people, through different ethnic dynamics, within or against, from and towards the hegemonic ethno-political system. So more specifically, I argue that populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina operates through a dialectical relationship between those three interconnected forms of populism: inter-ethnic, intra-ethnic, and cross-ethnic populism. Now, before I explain those three types of populism, let me now just briefly explain my theoretical point and what I understand by populism. Instead of relying on the ideational approach, most famously articulated by Cass Mood, defining populism as a thin-centered ideology, dividing society into the pure people and the corrupt elites, I rather draw on Ernesto Laclau's understanding of populism as a political logic that emerges when the dominant hegemonic formation fails to fulfill popular demands. So probably most of you are familiar with Laclau's theoretical approach. He defines populism not by the content, but by the form, as a form, sorry. So it is a discursive strategy that constructs political boundary between the people and those in power. So populism does not simply mobilize some pre-existing groups, but it creates that political groups. So it constructs the people by linking different social demands, social demand 1, social demand 2, social demand 3 that you can see, together into what Laclau calls a chain of equivalence. When there is one demand that temporarily comes to represent all the other social demands, it becomes an empty signifier that unifies those demands and help to create a political frontier between the people and an antagonistic order of the other. So the question here is how the ethnicized power-sharing system and populist response towards the system shapes the construction of the people as the populist subjects in return. So drawing on the Laclauian theoretical framework, I published a paper, and I can share the paper with you afterwards, that identifies those key elements of Laclau's approach and categorizes them according to the three forms of ethnic dynamics that I already mentioned here. So outside, within, and across ethnic groups. So I will start with the first one, with the inter-ethnic populism. And that is the most visible and dominant form of populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it overlaps with what was in the most of the previous research defined as ethno-nationalist populism. It constructs antagonistic frontiers horizontally, so not vertically, but horizontally, among ethnic groups, dividing our people and our elites from their people and their elites. So it's not a vertical division, it's a horizontal division. And here the emptiness of the signifier is constrained by presumed ethnic principles. So ethnic demands are in play. And with essentialized understanding of the identities, the discursive construction of the people takes an ethnic direction, where the ethnic principle defines the elements that can enter into the chain. And so constructing a populist identities. Now there are some particular demands from every ethnic group, but because of the time, I will leave it so we can talk about that in Q&A. But here, what I want just to address is that the ethnicity is not cultural, but is populistically constructed political subject towards the political system, because none of the three ethnic groups is satisfied by the power-sharing political system established after the war. Because all of the three ethnic groups had different visions of how the society and the country should look like. And this power-sharing system and sharing power among those groups is something that none of those three ethnic groups aimed for. So they have their demands towards the system that they feel that is unjust for the people. And so the populist construction of the ethnicized people is being created by those unmet demands of changing that constitutional order. The second form is intra-ethnic populism. And what is also interesting after the Dayton Peace Agreement and the power-sharing model basically created three parallel political arenas: Bosnia, Croats, and Serb. So we have three-party subsystems. We have elections on the state level, but electoral competition primarily takes place within those ethnic groups. There is not a political party that all of the ethnic groups really identify with. You have some multi-ethnic parties, but they only win in territories where one ethnic group is majority. So this is why populist logic remains confined to monoethnic segments rather than entire population. And this is also why previous research mostly focused on its dominant ontic manifestation and the horizontal tradition of dividing society. But when recognizing vertical populist trajectories, they recognize it as novelties, but they fail to explain them more systematically. So hence intra-ethnic populism assumes a discursively constructed, the so-called vertical frontier is expressed within monoethnic groups. So you have this vertical frontier, but it is only within an ethnic group. The people against the corrupt elites, but it is our people against our elites. And there are different, of course, demands. Mostly the political opposition that use populist elements from the Laclauan theoretical framework, they accuse the ethnic elites for monopolization of ethnic representation. They are accusing them for capturing the institutions, public resources, or for systemic corruption. And what is also important here is, although they try to, there is no, how to say, we don't have a very obvious populist actor like you have in Europe or in other states, but you can find populist elements within the opposition. And mostly there are splinter parties or opposing parties within the ethnic groups that mobilize populist rhetorics, claiming the return of the power to the people and appealing to the true people who have been become hostages of one leader or one party, rather than those privileged political insiders from that connected to the party clientelism of those groups. But what is important is, although this form of populism constructs this political frontier between the people and their ruling elites, it does not transcend the ethnic framework, as the political subject still remains ethnically defined and ethnically bounded. And this brings me to the last type, and perhaps the most fragile form of populism, that is cross-ethnic populism. So here we have the populist attempt to challenge the ethno-political hegemony to the creation of one universal cross-ethnic populist subject. Cross-ethnic populism attempts to construct the people as citizens rather than as members of ethnic groups vertically opposed both to the elites and to the power-sharing system. So it tries to articulate demands that cut ethnic divisions, typically social economic grievances, demands for justice, anti-corruption claims, and broader calls for institutional accountability. The examples include mostly popular protest and unrest, bottom-up deliberative forums, and civil society in general. So we don't talk here too much about political parties, since the political parties are confined. They compete mostly in monoethnic electoral units that are not official, of course, but it's created. So I will not go into details here, but I will just take one example of the protest back in 2013-14 that used the slogan, "We are hungry" in 3 languages. And because Bosnian, Croat, and Serb language are 99% the same language, just using some different words for describing the same things, but it's a different language from my point of view. So in that slogan, that "we are hungry" in 3 languages explicitly constructed a vertical frontier, we the people, as citizens, against the establishment that makes the people feeling hungry. However, articulating demands that transcend ethnic divisions becomes challenging, as they, in some form, still reflect national concerns within monoethnic subsystems. And this is why all the attempts so far failed to establish a stable system of signification. Also, ethno-national elites often reframe those mobilizations as threats to the own people, portraying them as something externally driven from the other ethnic groups to destabilize that group. So this led to an equivalent chain that could not extend further within the society, and failing to articulate a stable point of identification to unify heterogeneous demands around which a new political subjectivity beyond the ethno-national could be constructed. So in this sense, cross-ethnic populism reveals that both emancipatory potential of populism that is not really often debated about, but also structural limits of ethnopolitical populist logic in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So taken together, to conclude, these 3 forms of populism are not isolated. They interact dialectically, as interethnic populism reinforces ethnic fragmentation and stabilizes the power-sharing logic, which is a paradox. I can explain that later. While they are basically criticizing the power-sharing logic, they are, on the other way, stabilizing it. On the other side, intra-ethnic populism introduces competition within ethnic camps, which also is important because it challenges the elite dominance of one ethnic group. And finally, cross-ethnic populism attempts to destabilize the entire hegemonic configuration by constructing, or at least trying to construct, a new political subjectivity beyond ethnicity. So what all of this tells us? First, that populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not an external pathology of liberal democracies, but is generated from within the power-sharing post-conflict structure of the state. Secondly, that the Dayton Peace Agreement produces internal logics that continuously politically reconstruct antagonistic frontiers within the society. And finally, that populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina cannot be described either as democratic or anti-democratic. Rather, it is a political logic that can entrench ethnic exclusion, pluralize internal competition, but also potentially open space for new democratic subjectivities. And that brings me back to Leila's introductory notes, that this demonstrates how populism operates, not only how populism operates in divided post-conflict power-sharing context, but also how it creates and constructs people, and that the construction of the people is never neutral, and it's never something that is pre-assumed, but it is always mediated and constructed within the society and the dynamics of that particular society. So hoping that I have not broken the time, I will stop here and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was an excellent presentation. We got more intricacies of the constructing the populism and image of people, particularly in the interaction with institutions. And now we're moving further to this interaction and how the institutions might incorporate this pressure coming from the failed, let's say, democratic practice. And we're going to listen to a very interesting experience, which is analyzed by 16 Van Utrecht. So she will tell us the story of institutionalizing the assembled people. Thank you so much. The floor is yours.
Yeah, can you hear me well? Perfect. So thank you so much, Leila, for this introduction, and thank you a lot, Bülent and Reka, if I pronounce it well, for this organization. So for centuries, the task of both instituting a democratic system and making decisions then after on public affairs have been reserved to a professional political class of specialists. This presentation that I drew from my doctoral thesis defends the hypothesis that in response to this monopolization of both instituent and instituted political activity, ordinary individuals are capable not only of deciding on public affairs, but also on determining how they will decide. That is going at contrario to the general democratic innovations that is going from the top down and decided by the states or by policymakers. This is a hypothesis I examined through a fieldwork that I conducted with the radical democracy experiments, one of assemblies and direct democracy in Commercy, in Meuse, in France. From the beginning of the Yellow Vests, the Gilets Jaunes movement in 2018, until during which the group organized in direct democracy with everyday assemblies where people would decide on an equal footing, and there would be no leaders but only a spokesperson that would rotate, and also confederating among several assemblies. So from that experiment of the Yellow Vest, some of them presented a list at the municipal elections of March 2020 to actually give the entire power to the Popular Assembly of the city. So the sole program of the municipal election of that list was to connect the mandate of the elected people to the Popular Assembly that would gather the entirety of that would at least be open to the entirety of the town, a town of approximately 5,400 people by that time. So the practices of direct democracy in assemblies were instituted from the beginning of the Yellow Vest movement, but it was during this electoral phase that they would undertake this task of institutionalizing what the democratic system might look like, because what we have for the moment is precisely the opposite of having an assembled people deciding. So basically what they were trying to do is to do precisely what the representative government doesn't do, which is granting an institutional role to the assembled people, according to the word of Manin in his book, Principles of Representative Government. So it would shift the paradigm from a way of exercising power from mere consent to power to one that would, where the people assembled in popular assemblies would precisely exercise public power. So during the electoral campaign, the group drafted a few documents, a local constitution to see how that power would be organized, a commitment charter as well to organize the relationship between the assembly and the elected people, And during that constituent work, because it was really indeed a constituent work, they reinterpreted fundamental political concepts, but through the lens of direct democracy and assemblies, contrary to the one we have now, which is representative democracy. And so in my PhD and in this paper now, I try to reconstruct this system of direct democracy in assemblies that is both imagined but also instituted by the actors based on their practice and in their objective to replace representative democracy. So basically, they really engaged in an in-depth theoretical explanation of how this system might function, the practical challenges that the assembly might encounter, and which rules would actually govern the exercise of power should they be elected. So I'm going to present this presentation, this in two parts, this presentation in two parts. The first one is just to see quickly how the group went from a prefiguration of direct democracy in assemblies to the institutionalization of these practices during the electoral period. And the second would be the concrete institutionalization of the assembly based on their practice. And I'll focus on precisely one to be able to go in depth in the ethnography. Just so for the context, it's part of my PhD's Theory and Practice of Communalist Direct Democracy, self-government by the assembled people. I defended it in 2024. And basically, I have two endeavors in that PhD. The first one is the elaboration of a normative theory of democracy based on assembly direct democracy that I call communalist direct democracy, based on the ideas of Murray Bookchin. So I try to make this dialogue with other democratic theories. And the second part, which might seem antagonist, is a reconstruction of this practical application by a movement to both challenge and enrich the theory. And I try to combine those two antagonistic approach in the concept of inductive political theory, which is basically a concept of trying to ask normative questions to what is existing and derive normative theories, democratic theories from that. And basically, the main goal is to produce political theory grounded in empirical qualitative research and to allow field actors to answer fundamental political theory questions, and this time democracy and self-government questions. So I did a field work of 2 years with participant observation of activities, meetings, assemblies, demonstrations. I did 2 series of interviews before and after the election. I participated in a 2 days collective interview, and also I gathered some 2,500 documents from the movement. So first, I'm gonna see how the group evolved from the prefigurative phase of direct democracy during the assembly, during the Yellow Vest movement, which was quite spontaneous movement. I'm not going to be able to go in depth in that movement. I'm just going to say here that it's very heterogeneous movement, and the case of Commercy is quite singular in that constellation. But the general critique of representative democracy and of representation in general kind of went through the entire movement. So that's something something that can be said about the movement, but the answer that Commercy gave, the city of Commercy gave, is quite singular. And so during these general assemblies, they instituted practices of direct democracy. So basically, that was to answer their critique of representative government. So the principle of one person, one vote, the equality in speech expression, the requirement that all decisions must be made by the assembly, the appointment of delegates with imperative mandates, the creation of a local citizens' initiative referendum. They also had an open agenda and open notes for people who wouldn't be able to come at the shack, because they had a shack in the city center during their daily general assemblies. And so basically, like many other movements, so it's what they did there is not exceptional. We had all the assemblies movement of Occupy Wall Street and the like, of Indignados, etc. So they were prefiguring basically the democratic society that they wished for, and that is instantiated in one of a quote of an actor, which during the time that they would organize this local referendum, citizens' initiative referendum against the destruction of the shack by the mayor, which was, we didn't wait for permission to do it, we set it up ourselves with our own means. Basically, like the councils that function or as organs of struggles during various revolution, and that became, according to the words of Hannah Arendt, the permanent organs of governments, or in the words of Rosa Luxemburg, the pillars of the new order. The Commercy Assembly was initially just a vehicle for the struggle, and slowly it evolved into a form that would endeavor to exercise public power permanently. And so they sought to institutionalize the collective autonomy that they created during that social revolt to try to perpetuate and expand direct democracy and replace a representative democracy by direct democracy. So even though it was highly prefigurative, that moment, the phase of the campaign was less prefigurative, because at that time it was less the moment of trying absolutely to decide in direct democracy, but more to build a democratic process, to build a democratic constitution, and to really institutionalize and answer all these questions that would rise when we think, how can we exercise the power differently than through elected representatives? And so basically, they ask all these questions of how to transfer that power to the assembly through the drafting of a local constitution. So the local constitution, there's the preamble there that I post on the slide, and you can have a picture of a meeting of the constitution drafting. Basically was trying to establish how the assembly would exercise the power granted by the elections, should they be elected, and whether or not how the assembly would function, its commission, the deliberation mode, the decision-making processes, the appeals as well, which is what I'm going to focus on, the articulation with the municipal council, etc. And so what I'm going to do now is, first, I'm going to just mention the fundamental political theory concept that they rethought based on their practice, and that they try to institutionalize otherwise. And then I'm going to focus on one of them. So they, for example, rethought the way the constituent paradox, which is basically to try to find the initial legitimacy of establishing how we're going to decide. That they summed up in a question of how to decide on how to decide. So they completely rethought that. Also, the boundaries of the assembly's power. So where the power would be exercised, they had a lot of thought about exactly the location, because in Commercy, the city hall is actually a castle in a city that is quite working class and deindustrialized. It kind of raises question of access and symbolic access. So they thought of that, of which power, of exactly who would hold the power. That would lead the question that even though it's a Commercy population, you have the issue of self-selection and the participation problem, the fact that not everybody will be able to pass the doors of the assembly, but also how they're gonna the effective participation problem. They also discussed information modalities. Progressively, they developed a vision of the necessity of deliberation that they already had during the Yellow Vest, but that they really developed at that time. They also have elaborated decision-making mechanisms and revising how they would revise decision and the authority that they would give to pass decision. And so in that framework, they created self-limiting institutions. That's the thing I'm going to focus on. But just so you have a general background as well of what they did also, is that far from the unanimism and conflict avoidance that they would be accused of, a lot would say that, yeah, well, it's a populist movement. They're all agreeing. They have this unanimous democracy, well, not democracy precisely, but this unanimity that goes through the movement, which is obviously not one. They tried to democratize the dissensus. So that's a word I'm taking from Samuel Hayat. And so what they try to do precisely, and I'll come back to it, is to say that the dissensus, the political conflict, is not the monopoly of representatives, but can be actually handled by the people when assembled. They also rethought the concept of representation, but I'm not going to get into that this time. So,
16, you might have only 3 minutes. Is it okay?
Well, please. Sorry. So the safeguards against the risk of direct democracy. Basically, there's an essential. It was essentially a procedural conception of direct democracy. So basically, whatever the people would decide would be what would be acted there. But there's of course risks that the assembly make undesirable decision. There, we can relate this to actually the concept of Castoriadis, which is of the graphe paranomon in the Greek democracy. And it was based on the principle that even though the people makes the law, the people can actually err and the people can correct itself. So it's really the example of a self-limiting institution by the people itself. And so in Commercy, kind of like the translation of that was the assembly has the right to vote for nonsense or stupid things in the translation. And it's good because there's nothing more educational than collective nonsense. There was, of course, this tension around the safeguards. Some were really scared that this power given to the people would be used, for example, to cut the subsidies for migrant association, etc. And basically, a lot of people wanted more to just, leave it and we'll see what happens. And that's reflected here in a discussion where Raoul, that's how I call him, says, to a person that actually pushed this endeavor to constitutionalize everything and to try to put safeguards, saying that I don't know why you want to compartmentalize everything. And then somebody else says, you can set an ideological framework, otherwise you've lost. That means that all the peoples and ideas it means there are people and ideas you don't want. But this assembly is meant for all ideas to be expressed. When do you talk to people who don't want this? And so basically they would say, yeah, you can inspire from the Greeks, but to me that's pointless. In that case, we're just another party. So there was this important thing to say that if you reject conflict from the start with safeguards, the safeguards you want to put in place, you forget the basics. You do what others do, you gradually create an insular partisan dynamic. And so basically what is very important to say here is that the main purpose was to democratize the dissensus. So it's rejecting partisanship and not conflict, not having this idea of a unanimous people. And so rather than being, the importance was to stay neutral or non-partisan, not affiliated to any political party, so that everyone who would come to the assembly would be able to express disagreements, debates, persuade and be persuaded. And that came from also their practice during the Yellow Vests, because at that time, some people who were voting for the far right ended up helping association of migrants. So they could see the process of deliberation actually affecting the people who would take part in the assemblies. And so it's a rejection of partisanship here, which does not mean an aspiration to unanimity or a rejection of conflict, but just a democratizing of conflict, saying that it's not only to the parties and the representative to structure conflict, but it's actually to the assembled people to do it as well. I'm going to go very, very quick. Just one of the ways they would create a self-limiting institution was to say they had this preamble at first, which is that the assembly had to safeguard by its decision the well-being of everybody in accordance with the social and environmental stakes, and favor the self-management of the commons. That's the only kind of like substantial part in that constitution. And that kind would be used in case there would be a decision that would be appealed to. And then a citizens council, Conseil constitutionnel citoyen, citizens constitutional council would be drawn by lot to decide whether or not that decision would be in accordance with the preamble of the constitution. If not, it would be sent back to the assembly. And if yes, if it's in accordance, then it would be taken for granted. That's only but one of the safeguards that they created for that. And so, I assume I'm done. So I'm just gonna, sorry, I plan to say way more, but as always, it goes too fast. And I'm gonna end up with this quote of Castoriadis, who would say that creating non-alienating forms of democracy where the people participate in modern society, it cannot be the work of the theorists, but of the entire people. And that's really what I try to show here, is to say that a movement can actually create forms of direct democracy according to which the people will be able to democratically decide, but that they can also decide on how they will decide. And that's a call also to democratize the way we think about political questions in general. Thank you, and sorry for being slightly wrong.
Thank you so much. That was an excellent continuation of the topic we started, and it's getting more to the incorporation, or let's say the people's creation of the institutions already, the rules according to the act. And then we having to the last one, which brings us closer to how the elitism is going to be overcome in the international relations, apparently, by reimagining diplomatic representation as a pillar of democracy. Are we having that presentation today?
Yes, that is
Yes.
me.
Yeah,
Thank you
so
much.
it's Nieves Fernanda Gancela Sanchez. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I believe some slides will come up. Yes. Let's see. Okay. Everyone can hear me, right? I think, okay. Thank you so much. Due to time constraints, I'll try to also go through the presentation as quickly as possible. This ongoing research basically examines the democratization, but from the diplomatic angle. So examining diplomatic representation as a foundational pillar of democracy, arguing that the exclusion of unrepresented nations, peoples, indigenous peoples, and minority communities from meaningful diplomatic engagement constitute a structural failure of democratic governance at both national and international levels. In this research, I draw on critical and post-positive approaches to diplomacy, and mainly the concept of the right to diplomacy, and 3 case studies to explore the concept in practice. So we start by the opening of the United Nations Charter, which most of us might know. We the peoples, one slide before, thank you. We the peoples of the United Nations. While this is the opening of the UN Charter, we ask ourselves how far, though, does multilateral diplomacy today live up to this vision? Various scholars, including McConnell, Habib, and Henriksen, have studied how rapidly diplomacy has transformed in the past decades. So we see that diplomacy now has a broader engagement across a wider array of affairs, meaning that diplomats now are expected to engage in a diverse agenda, way more diverse than years ago. There's bigger involvement of multiple government departments and non-governmental actors, and there's also more spaces and forums with broader non-state participation, including minorities, indigenous peoples, and even the private sector. One of these scholars, Henriksen, states how today world bodies are not only representative of states, but also of the civil society. But in the research, we find that these spaces remain uneven and contested. Next slide. So when exploring diplomacy and diplomatic representation, we see an evolution of the understanding and conceptualization of diplomacy. So we find classical definitions first that are focused on a state-centric understanding of diplomacy. Sato defines it as a conduct of business between states. Others define it as the official channels of communication employed by members of a system of states. So it's clearly very state-centered. But the post-positive scholars challenge this idea. We find Sharp, for example, that understands diplomacy as a practice built on representation, as a set of institutions and processes for handling certain kind of relations between human beings. And Johnson, who brings a definition that's central to this research, links diplomatic representation to representative democracy. So very linked to the previous panelist's presentation, assuming that diplomats, much like elected politicians, are agents entrusted by principles. So in this same line, we ask ourselves, what is the nexus between democracy and diplomacy? So while democracy and diplomacy might have different outcomes or goals, because democracy seeks freedom, equality, diplomacy seeks to advance national interests through peaceful means, they do share similar principles. Negotiation, cooperation, and both have participation and representation at its core, ideally. But if diplomacy is supposed to mirror democratic ideals, shouldn't it actually reflect the full diversity of those it claims to represent? So that brings us to exploring what is the cost of not representing. The denial or barriers to diplomatic representation erase voices from spaces where decisions about their lives are made, compounding to violations of multiple international conventions, including, for example, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, International Labor Organization conventions, including number 169, and many others, which actually do ground the right to participation in international law. So this again brings us to the nexus between diplomacy and democracy. The democratization of diplomacy means diplomatic decision-making, like democracy, should be transparent, participatory, and accountable in order to fully reflect the diversity that it claims to represent. So this in the research brings us to the right to diplomacy framework, which is a concept that was developed by Fiona McConnell and Costas Constantino in 2023, which underpins democratic diplomacy by arguing that access and presence do not amount to meaningful participation. Meaningful participation actually involves going beyond symbolic presence, which includes the right to be consulted, to negotiate, to give free, prior, and informed consent over decisions that affect all people's lives, and to be able to shape the legal instruments that govern one's community. The right to diplomacy framework calls then for a transformation of this hierarchical, state-centered diplomatic system towards a system that recognizes actors' rights beyond state sovereignty and that fosters inclusive diplomatic practice. So through this framework, we also find that moving from the state-centric model of diplomacy to inclusive diplomatic practice, we require both normative and institutional shifts that guarantee the meaningful participation, consultation, and consent for all peoples. So in this research, I focus on one of the institutional pathways, the case of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization, which was founded in 1991. It is an NGO that was created to fill the gap, I quote, created by the de jure requirement of recognized statehood in order to participate in international decision-making fora. Its founding members, among which are Tibet, Estonia, before obtaining independence, the Uyghur people, East Timor, envisioned an international platform dedicated to advancing the voices of unrepresented and minority communities around the world, and hence today engages with international institutions and aims to mediate and facilitate dialogue between its members and the international community. So for this research, I focused on 3 of its members as case studies. The first one is Tibet. For decades, the Tibetan government in exile has worked to exercise its right to diplomacy despite a lack of state recognition. In a sustained attempt to claim the right to negotiate Tibet's future through the channels available, the government set up the Department for Information and International Relations, which has functioned as a de facto foreign ministry, establishing offices of Tibet around the world, led by representatives of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who have actually achieved ambassadorial recognition by parliaments and foreign ministries around the world. Lodi Gari, for example, the Dalai Lama's diplomatic special envoy and a former Tibetan representative to UNPO, conducted diplomatic negotiations on behalf of Tibet with Chinese authorities. And yet we see throughout the years that the international community's answer has been very consistent. Meetings between world leaders and the Dalai Lama have always usually been pushed off-site to unofficial spaces. Governments engage with Tibet without formally acknowledging its right to be engaged with. Without this right to diplomacy, Tibet cannot negotiate the terms of its people's future and can only continue advocating from the margins. Our second case is East Timor. So while Tibet illustrates the limits of diplomatic representation without sovereignty, East Timor shows what becomes possible when spaces for diplomatic representation are allowed and are made possible. East Timor joined UNPO under the National Council of Mobere Resistance during the Indonesian occupation. Jose Ramos Horta, today's president of East Timor, served as a representative to UNPO throughout this period as a diplomatic representative of the East Timorese people. His sustained engagement with the United Nations, with foreign governments, and with civil society through platforms including UNPO kept the East Timorese people visible. And without access to this diplomatic representation, the humanitarian crisis unfolding in East Timor would have risked remaining outside the forums where its resolution would ultimately be negotiated. Eventually, in 1999, UN-supervised referendum, which was grounded in the free and informed consent of the East Timorese people, demonstrated how diplomatic representation can make visible what exclusion from diplomacy renders invisible. And lastly, we find the case of the Chamorro people of Guam. The Chamorro indigenous peoples of Guam are United States citizens. And even though they hold passports for one of the world's oldest democracies, they cannot vote for their president. They have no Senate representation, and they elect only a non-voting delegate to the House. Decisions that govern their lives are made by a Congress in which they have no meaningful participation, so domestically Guam is disenfranchised. As a member of UNPO, Guam engages with international institutions through submissions to human rights mechanisms, raising the absence of the free, prior, and informed consent from the Chamorro people regarding the ongoing military expansion on the island and its struggle for cultural survival. However, despite their sustained attempt to engage, findings by the multiple UN special procedures, and despite the fact that Guam is part of the UN list of non-self-governing territories since 1946, its appeal to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization has still been resisted by the US. So this brings us to our conclusion, and hopefully I'm within the time that's allowed. So across all case studies, we find that exclusion from diplomatic spaces is a structural issue, and its consequences are several for human rights, cultural survival, and self-determination. And while institutional workarounds like UNPO are necessary, they are far from sufficient. UNPO members, like we see in the case of Guam or Tibet, will still be one step removed from the formal diplomatic standing that produces binding outcomes. However, institutions like UNPO do offer the necessary frameworks and best practices, like we see in the cases of East Timor and many other of its over 100 members in the past 35 years. The right to diplomacy is in the spirit of what genuinely democratic international order would require. Expanding diplomatic representation should not be peripheral to democracy, but a precondition to it. And democratizing diplomacy, however, requires institutional change. So our ongoing research, this paper, argues for a shift in how we understand diplomacy and democracy towards a model where meaningful participation is recognized as a democratic right for all peoples. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. And it definitely has probably a broader meaning, because if you remember the massive demonstrations against the war in Iraq in the UK, and that it did not have any effect on the foreign policy decisions, that kind of leads us to this issue that while, you know, minority, small states and unrecognized groups are remaining priority, but you can see that it's really a pressing issue and not only at that level. But thank you so much. Now we're coming to the reviews, critical reviews of the presentations. And the first one to speak is Christopher Magno, who's associate professor in the Department of Justice Studies and Human Services at Ghana University. And he will be followed by Amadeo Variale. Please, Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. I'm going to start with Jasmine Hasanovic's presentation on populism in Bosnia and Herzegovina, a country that emerged from the violent breakup of Yugoslavia in the 1990s. The key question that Jasmine asked: how does populism operate in a post-conflict society where politics is already structured around ethnic power sharing? Most studies of populism look at Western democracies where populist leaders mobilize the people against the political elites. But in Bosnia, present a different situation because politics there is organized around three main ethnic groups. The Bosniak, the Serbs, and the Croats share anti-communist position as she presented. The three dialectical relationship of ethnic populism. The first one is inter-ethnic populism, and the second is the intra-ethnic populism, and the third is the intra-ethnic populism, and the third intra, and the third is the inter-ethnic
cross-ethnic.
Cross-ethnic, that's right. The third is the cross-ethnic populism. So the first, about the ethnic populism, the first and most dominant type is the inter-ethnic populism. Here, politics is framed as conflict between ethnic communities. So political leaders often say things like, our people are under the threat from the others, and our group must defend itself. So in this form, populism becomes closely tied to ethno-nationalism. Political elites mobilize fear, war memories, and historical grievances to maintain support. Instead of people versus elite, the divide becomes our ethnic group versus their ethnic group. So it's horizontal. Demands from every ethnic group. Ethnicity is not cultural, but politically constructed and meet demands across. So the second type is the intra-ethnic populism. So this happened within a single ethnic groups. So here, opposition politicians challenge the leader of their own group by saying the current leaders are corrupt. They are betraying the people. We are the true representative of the nation. So this creates a people versus corrupt leaders within the group dynamic. So in this sense, populism can actually increase political competition and weaken dominant national elite. So the third type, which is the cross-ethnic populism, which is much weaker but very important. So this type tries to unite citizens across ethnic lines around shared problems such as corruption, unemployment, social inequality, lack of accountability, as he presented. So, like, we are hungry in all three languages. So that's the demand. So this highlight that ordinary people across ethnic groups share the same economic struggles. However, this movement often struggle because the political system keeps pulling people back into ethnic identities. So the key takeaway from this presentation is that populism in Bosnia is multi-layered instead of one simple conflict as we see. Ethnic competition between groups, leader competition within groups, occasional citizens movement across groups. So the author argues that Bosnia's political system both creates and sustains populism because ethnic identity is deeply embedded in political institutions. So what are the discussion questions here? So why do you think inter-ethnic populism remains stronger than cross-ethnic populism in Bosnia? And second, can populism ever help strengthen democracy, or does it always deepen political division? And it also reminds me of, in social media, there's a term that they use, psychographic profiling on social media. So it's the dialectical dynamics of ethnic populism can be observed in how online communities construct and defend digital identities that function like tribes or symbolic ethnicities. Every time we like or unlike, like in our Facebook, they recommend you who are the people that you're gonna add or not add based on your behavior. In Facebook, in social media. So algorithms categorize users based on behavioral patterns like share languages, behaviors, ideological signals, allowing individuals to cluster into identity-based networks that reinforce shared narratives. So within these networks, inter-ethnic populism emerges as conflict between different online tribes, ideological communities, political blocs, where each group frames itself as the authentic people against rival groups. So at the same time, intra-ethnic populism occurs within these same communities when members challenge leaders, influencers, or moderators who are perceived to have betrayed the group's values. So this produces a vertical frontier, a populist divide between ordinary member of the community and the perceived elite or gatekeepers within the tribe. So those psychographic profiling and algorithmic sorting intensify a dialectical cycle in which digital identities simultaneously generate horizontal conflicts between tribes and vertical conflicts within them. So mirroring the intra, and cross-dynamic, populism politics in Bosnia. So for let me see, 16. Okay. So for 16th paper, institutionalizing the assembled people, 16 asks the question, how can the people govern themselves directly, and how can grassroots democratic practices can be transformed into durable institution? So 16 papers examine this question through the case of the Citizen Assembly of Commercy, which emerged from the Yellow Vest movement in France, rather than simply protesting for representatives' democracy. So the movement attempted something far more ambitious, to institutionalize popular assemblies as the core political decision-making. Because in traditional sense, democracy is monopolized. There's a monopolization of institutionalization of democracy. So 16 situates the case with radical democratic theory, particularly drawing on Murray Bookchin's communalist model, where political power is exercised directly by citizens in assemblies rather than delegated permanently to representatives. So her paper argues that the Commercy movement sought to transform assembly democracy from a protest practice into a governing structure. So to do this, participants drafted a local constitution and an elected official charter, which were intended to ensure that if elected political authority would remain within the citizens' assembly composed of all residents. So in this process, the movement effectively acted as a constituent power, that it's the people themselves designing the political rules under which they would govern. So the core analytical question here, the paper highlight 3 central institutional challenges in transforming assembly democracy into governing system. So first, about the boundaries of power. Who constitute the people in the assembly? The Commercy model defined the assembly as all residents of the municipality, open to everyone without election or random selection. So however, this raises an important issue if the participation is voluntary, which introduces self-selection bias. Those who participate may not represent the broader population, creating questions about democratic legitimacy. So second, it's about the procedure of power. How do assemblies deliberate and make decisions? Initially, assemblies function primarily as spaces for expressing grievances, but over time, they evolved toward deliberative decision-making, where participants debate issues and potentially revise their preferences through discussion. So this reflects a shift from aggregative democracy, where preferences are simply counted, to deliberative democracy, where preferences are formed through collective reasoning. So this reminds me of Georgian Habermas' theory of communicative action, where he emphasized the role of the public sphere, a space where citizens engage in open debate about public issues. So the assemblies function as mini public sphere, where citizens present grievances, arguments are debated, participants question one another, collective understanding then emerges. So through this process, private concerns become public issues. So third is about the limits of power. So how can assembly coexist with an existing institution? Even if assemblies claim political authority, they still operate within system of representative government, elections, and legal constraints. So the movement therefore faced the tension between maintaining radical democratic principles and engaging with institutional politics, particularly during municipal elections. So the broader implication is one of the most important contribution of 16 paper is that it demonstrates how social movements can become laboratories for democratic innovation. Rather than merely critiquing representative democracy, the Commercial movement attempted to design an alternative democratic institution grounded in lived political experiences. So this case shows that democratic theory does not only emerge from philosophers or institutions, it can also emerge from collective experimentations by citizens themselves. So these are, few questions. So can assembly democracy realistically function as a governing system, or is it primarily suited for grassroots mobilization? And this number 2 question is really important for me. How can assemblies address the challenge of unequal participation and self-selection? And third is institutionalizing radical democratic practices likely to transform representative democracy, or will institutions ultimately absorb and neutralize these experiments?
Thank you so much. Have you finished, Christopher?
Is my time over?
Yes.
Okay,
Unfortunately.
I can stop. I can stop with, I can ask later, Nieves, I have discussion questions for Nieves, how do the cases of Tibet, East Timor, and Guam illustrate different forms of political exclusion, and what factors determine whether diplomatic advocacy can successfully lead to international recognition of self determination. Yeah, thank you very much. I think we can
Okay,
proceed
thank you
with
so
the second
much.
discussion.
Thank you so much. Now we go to Amedeo. Amedeo, your turn. Thank you. Could you turn your microphone, please? No, it's still not on. No.
Okay. Now? Yeah, sorry. I'm not too big on technology, believe it or not. Okay. So everyone can hear me now.
Yes, yes.
Can
Please
everyone
go.
hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, we
Okay.
could.
Sorry about that. Okay, so thank you everyone for the interesting presentations. Beginning with Professor Hasanovich's work, as a researcher myself, who often prefers to study politics and ideology from a comparative perspective and provide definitions and taxonomies. I really enjoyed reading about this new framework to classify Bosnian populism. Studying Bosnian populism in a post-Dayton era is fundamental to comprehending how populist mobilization interacts with externally imposed power-sharing institutions in a post-conflict consociational democracy. So as I just hinted, I believe that a major strength of Professor Hasanovich's work is the categorization itself of the three distinct populisms. Essentially, inter-ethnic, intra-ethnic, and cross-ethnic populism serve as very important categories because, as one may deduce, they are not only useful to understanding populism across the spectrum in Bosnia, but they also may tell us something about populism in Western Europe, the Americas, and beyond. For instance, when I think of inter-ethnic populism, apart from numerous examples in Bosnia and the Balkans, I'm also thinking of parties that have been successful in my native country, Italy, such as the early days Northern League, for example, that distinguished and discriminated between Northern and Southern Italians, and at the same time engaged with anti-statist, anti-elitism. When I think of intra-ethnic populism, the category, this certainly rings a bell when looking at parties of the populist left, such as the Five Star Movement, Podemos in Spain, Syriza, of course, in Greece, and other movements that have been electorally relevant and have highlighted this political democratic potential of having ordinary citizens understand their role in democratization processes and in decision-making processes within societal and parliamentary frameworks. So, of course, as explained in the article by Professor Hasanovich, it is absolutely true that populism may enhance political pluralism when it gives silent majorities and silent minorities as well, at times, a voice and a political role in society. So this has also been the case with cross-ethnic populism. Cross-ethnic populism is something that maybe perhaps we come across less frequently. There are, however, populist transnational movements, such as Democracy in Europe 2025, led by the Greek left-wing intellectual and former politician Yanis Varoufakis. So in other words, the theoretical framework used is particularly useful, in my opinion, due to not only its intellectual quality, but its travelability, its universality. And it can be used to study different phenomena in different contexts, essentially. I understand that in the article made available to me by ECPS, Populist Challenges in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Professor Hasanovich used the discursive ontological approach rather than the recently popular ideational approach, which is the one that I mostly use, actually. But fair enough, the reconstruction of the political frontier by using the people as an empty signifier, Ernesto Laclau's post-foundational approach, I find it very interesting. I won't comment much on that because, to be honest, I attempted reading Laclau's main book on populist reason a few years ago, and I found it very conceptually challenging. But I certainly do understand how Professor Hasanovich adopted these theories. It makes sense in the context of Bosniak populism. So I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm curious to know, however, when it comes to parties, interethnic populist parties, the Serb Democratic Party, SDS, or the Party of Democratic Action, if I'm getting it right, SDA, or even the pro-ethnic Croat HDZ. So is populism really the primary element of the political cocktail? Because it seems to me that here we are dealing with ethno-nationalism rather than populism in the strict sense. I can understand how People and Justice, NIP, is populist because anti-elitism is the main element there. But regarding the ones I mentioned, the inter-ethnic ones, I'm wondering whether these are often, after all, ethno-nationalist extreme right parties that merely use populism rhetorically as a strategy. I mean, I don't want to contradict myself. I understand. I do absolutely think the categories are interethnic, intraethnic, etc., are extremely useful. This is just a point for further reflection, let's say. I'll move on to the next presentation by Professor Van Ootrieve. The paper is very relevant with populist movements on the rise. We have to understand what they stand for, but even more importantly, how they operate. So interestingly, this has more to do, this paper, this article had more to do with what I would call left-wing populism or radical left populism, to borrow a term from two Greek scholars, rather than with the usual radical right populist actors we often discuss. So to a great extent, the paper helped us understand how in a time of representative democracy, where representative democracy shows its weaknesses, as important as it is, it shows its weaknesses mainly by producing detached and unresponsive professional political elites. So now there is this alternative. The deliberative democratic forms are conceptualized and operationalized, especially at a local level. So essentially, direct democracy can indeed be carried forward by ordinary citizens to some extent. This is what the paper shows us. So in many ways, the Yellow Vests and the Citizens' Assembly which the article focuses on, remind me on what the Dutch political scientist Cas Mudde framed as an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, at least contemporary undemocratic liberalism. I would say the main strength of the work resides in the fact that it captures the operationalization of democracy, of direct democracy, and describes it comprehensively. This is important because whilst most of us know what direct democracy means in theory, it is in practice that I think that scholarly work needs to be developed in its practice. The example on page 10 of the article regarding how major decisions should be dealt with in terms of popular deliberation and outcome, and the tension between the municipal council and the citizens' assembly in Commercy, France, was particularly compelling because it is essentially an illustration of the eternal tension that exists between direct democracy in its pure radical form, and representative liberal democracy. So, as I said, the paper is very strong. I personally would have included more background on the political context, on what political context in France has facilitated the rise of the Yellow Vests, and what opposition they have faced from the French state, or even how direct democracy can degenerate into dangerous forms of autocracy, mob rule. But of course, I realize this goes beyond the scope of the article, and it's not really strictly necessary, but perhaps future work could incorporate these themes. So I do think that the article is both very sophisticated and detailed, with a robust theoretical grounding and methodological framework, including a significant amount of field work, of course. 36 interviewees is, if I'm not wrong, if I read correctly, is a lot. I managed 10 for my thesis, so I think that some things were slightly harder for me personally to understand because I don't have a solid background in law as much as I would like. That said, I have a much better idea of how the Yellow Vests, or what the Yellow Vests represent. And I was particularly interested in the fact that there are many parallels with the Italian five-star movement, which I have studied during my PhD, imperative mandates you've mentioned, the one person, one vote idea, and how this works in practice at the local level. So especially the idea that Professor Van Otrieve included on page 12, this idea of the quote, of freely informed, critical people that enriches the reflection of others, is very much the same idea put forward by the five-star movement and of many European left-wing populist movements and parties. So I hope I still have time for the last one. To conclude with the very interesting article by Dr. Nieves Cancelas Sanchez, I have three main things to say. Firstly, I did not know about the situation in Guam, certainly not in detail, and I found it shocking how they have no U.S. Congress voting representation. Interestingly enough, neither does Puerto Rico, if I'm not incorrect, and citizens of Guam, like Puerto Ricans, are unable to vote in the U.S. presidential election. So, as far as I understand, so one can certainly argue that the status of Puerto Rico, of Guam, and even Washington District of Columbia reflects a democratic contradiction within the one of the oldest democracy, the United States, by highlighting a gap between democratic principle and constitutional structure. So there's very much this conflict. And secondly, I'm not really familiar with the post-positive approach by Constantino and McConnell, to be honest. It's the first time I hear about it, so I will not be able to delve into detailed theoretical and methodological considerations. I can say that the presentation taught me some things and highlighted aspects of the diplomacy and contradictions that I did not pay enough attention to in the past, and considering the trio of case studies, Guam, Tibet, and Timor-Leste, Timor-East, if I understood correctly. Timor-Leste, Timor-East is the only one that can be considered to some extent, and I highlight to some extent because it took a while to get there, considering the UN and etc. It's the only one that can be considered the diplomatic success story and a positive example of how popular and a positive example of an outcome of popular self-determination. To link it to what we said before, so a region, there was a referendum to determine its independence. So this is also in some way direct democracy, or it is in all senses. So thirdly, my main takeaway after the last presentation is that sovereignty provides order and legitimacy in diplomacy. I think this is undeniable, helping to prevent chaos or endless claims. Yet, on the other hand, positive perspectives show us that formal authority often overlooks who actually has and deserves a political voice in the strict sense. So I think that I will conclude with this last point. Thank you.
Thank you so much for these brilliant reviews of both opponents. Now we'll have a chance, the speakers will have a chance to respond. Let's start with the reverse order, if you don't mind. If Nieves Cancela Sanchez could start responding, that would be great. And then 16, and Jasmine, thank you.
Thank you. Well, to begin with, Amadeo's comment, I'm very grateful. Just because of the extent of the article, it's impossible to talk about so many other of the cases that UNPO works with or that has worked with. As I mentioned in the beginning when I introduced UNPO, UNPO has also had members that are now former members because they are now states, right? And they obtained international recognition as states, like Estonia, for example. Latvia was also a member back then. So we do see cases of former members that want to achieve statehood. However, it is not the case for all members who just seek recognition and to raise their voices in international national spaces. Or seek the representation, just like in the case of Guam, for example, like you well pointed out, the same or similar situation to Puerto Rico. And I'm very glad that you enjoyed the presentation and the examples, the case studies. In the case of the post-positive approaches, of course, we find more post-positivist analyses on diplomacy by other scholars. In the case of Costas Constantino and Fiona McConnell, they were the ones who developed the concept of the right to diplomacy and the right to diplomacy framework. So putting these new constructive, critical approaches and post-positive approaches of diplomacy into practice and how all peoples can be properly represented in diplomatic practice. But it is also very recent. That it was developed in 2023. So hopefully this research can also help contribute in expanding this work. And I believe I didn't quite catch Christopher's questions because he had run out of time. So maybe if he can just mention them again, and then I can give the word to 16, and I can then circle back if needed.
Do you want me to mention it now?
Yes, I can just make note of it, and then I can just give the word to 16 and Jasmine.
So here's a really short questions for you, framework. So in relation to your presentation, you are framing the sovereign states at the United Nations can be understood not only as legal representative of territorial state, but also ideally as a consultative political bodies that speak on behalf of the diverse population within their borders, including ethnic groups, civil society organizations, region, and minority communities. So in democratic theories, state diplomacy is assumed to reflect the aggregated will of the people, meaning that what a state presents at the international forum, such as the United Nations, should emerge from the internal consultation representation, and accountability mechanism. So, however, in practice, states often act not purely as consultative representative, but also as strategic actors pursuing national interests, geopolitical interests, or regime priorities. So this creates a tension between two models of diplomatic representation. So first, the consultative model, where state diplomacy reflects the voices and interests of external constituencies. And second, the strategic sovereignty model, where state leaders act autonomously in international negotiations. So the right to diplomacy framework highlights in the presentation challenge this gap by arguing that when states fail to adequately represent internal communities such as the indigenous people, Guam, Puerto Rico, so stateless nation or non-self-governing territories, those communities should have a direct or mediated access to international diplomatic platforms.
Yes, of course, because of time constraints, I couldn't then go deeper into the fact that not only are international organizations, a system built by states for states, and that leave out all other peoples that also have voices in decision or should have a voice in decision-making processes, but that the system today that is obviously state-centered also has certain barriers in the very limited spaces that have been made available for non-state actors to participate. So mechanisms like the ECOSOC or other forums, for example, the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the only other forum in the UN for let's say, what is tagged or categorized as minorities who are far from actually being minorities in their countries is the UN Forum on Minority Issues. They also have barriers or are not as, or are still uneven or are not sufficient to provide a space and the direct diplomatic representation of all these peoples. So just because of time constraints, I will give the word to 16 and Jasmine, but thank you so much, Christopher, and if there's any other question, please send it on the chat and I'll reply there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And 16, please respond.
Thanks a lot. Well, I mean, thanks so much for this great engagement with my work. I'm honored. So thank you and also for the very relevant question of you both. I'm going to answer first on the one of participation because it's one that agitated me for a while, and actually that really was very important for the group as well. And so the first thing, I mean, because it rests as I mentioned, and you as well, the entire legitimacy of the system rests on that as well. If you have almost nobody showing up, well, then there's no representation possible. The first thing is that they saw it as a long-term process and not only as a numerical aspect of it. So basically, they would say that maybe at first there wouldn't be a lot of people, but progressively there would be even more. Because things get decided. So often we see that participation in deliberative assemblies go down because they have no effect. Basically, that's what you could see in France with the Climate Citizens Convention that yields. I mean, they deliberated wonderfully. They would show how citizens could deliberate, etc. But then President Macron would just turn away the things that he didn't want to. So to ask for citizens to take on the very little free time they have, you have to have like actual result. And so that's one argument as well, to say that if they have the entirety of power, then that would motivate people to act in it. And especially in a village next to it that actually got City Hall, because I didn't end up on that, but they didn't get City Hall, unfortunately. But they present a list in 10 days. So 6 years later, we'll see what comes of that. In another village where they actually implemented on the same thing, 100 people out of 180 would come, so 80 people, child included. So that would be a great turnout, which shows that regular people, not militant at all, would actually show up if that's institutionalized. They would also think of, so the answers to the participation problem really, again, comes from their practice. For example, they would see that a lot of people wouldn't come to the I mean just the hour between reproductive work and productive work, that would pose a lot of problems. So they created the idea of having several assemblies discussing the same topic, but since they knew deliberation was very, very important to change their own minds, they would have a moment of a recap of all these arguments, and then an ability to vote either online or there, because also the digital divide is a huge thing in that city. So they also had like ways of having a shuttle that would bring people either to the assembly or to vote at City Hall. They also planned childcare in service to be able to have the people who had childcare duties. And so a lot of these things really come from the fact that, I mean, those are working class people who sometimes have shift in the night, or I mean, they have like important days, but still during the Yellow Vest movement, they managed to be quite active every day. And so they would assume that in a lower movement, they would still be able to maintain a certain level, at least an assembly every, I don't know, 2 weeks or month, because that would be institutionalized. And also they had a way of like having a local referendum that would be triggered if 10% of the electorate wasn't agreeing with the solution. That would replace the fact that if an assembly would be too little, there would be too little people. The question about whether or not it can realistically function, well, here right now in this situation, obviously not, because as you said, representative government is right there. So even though we have like insulated cities working on the basis of assemblies, that would be a problem. But the precise issue is to not be insulated and to have this idea of having several self-governed communes that would be confederated among themselves with imperative and recallable mandates, and then to try to create a dual power situation between, on the one hand, the state, and on the other, the confederation of communes. And that's something, so that's the end goal of the strategy. And one way of getting that is to gain the communes through the election, which is the strategy I followed in Commercy. And I mean, in the world, there's the situation in Rojava, which is a situation of the Kurdish people in Syria, which is at threat at the moment, but which actually on a territory of 2 times Belgium is working in this way. So it shows that it's possible, but the issue is more how to get there, because that happened in a civil war. We're in a situation of a capitalist and democratic representative democracy. And just to finish with the question of Amadeo, thanks a lot for that. I mean, yeah, there's a huge danger, of course, with direct democracy, and actually the far right party of the Rassemblement National took up this idea of the Yellow Vest, of the Citizens' Initiative referendum. The main safeguard for the people of Commercy would be that deliberation is the way to actually convince people. We can find that actually representative government is not that will preserve the country from the far right. It's not going to be the case in 2027, but actually getting and talking with people who vote for the Rassemblement National, the far right party, and convince them on the ground would be. And so that would be that's really a deep belief that deliberation can change people, and that's something they gain from the Yellow Vest. But again, they're not representative of the whole Yellow Vest. Actually, the Yellow Vest movement is not left-wing at all. Some part are, but it's very and it's really they want to get out of like traditional politics category. So yeah, I'm gonna finish there because I'm too long already. But thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you so much. And now, Jasmine, your turn.
So thank you, Christopher and Amadeo. Thank you a lot for your comments and engaging in the work. I'm really impressed, like 16 as well. Yes, probably I will start with the second question from Christopher, and then move to Amadeo's two very interesting points. Christopher said, does populism deepens political division? Well, I would say that division is not an anomaly in the politics. It is an essence of politics. So populism does not create division. Rather, it is a logic of political mobilization. So populism only articulates existing antagonisms in the society and linking them into this chain of equivalence from which a political subject is formed. And what I argue is that in my country, well, in most of the countries nowadays, unfortunately, we need democracy. And why I say that we need democracy in my country, because the consociational power sharing system basically changed democracy with ethnocracy. So changing demos with ethnos. We don't have demos as the main political subject. We have ethnicity as the main political subject. So we need the people, the civic people, to be the holders of the sovereignty. And that's why I think that constructing the people differently from the way the people are constructed and defined right now is very important, because without that understanding of people, we also cannot have a proper democracy. And that's also where I see that democracy cannot function only through its procedural understanding, through elections. And yeah, so populism is one of the main logics through which this political subject is formed. And now I move to the second question, why inter-ethnic populism is stronger than cross-ethnic. And this also applies to Amadeo's question, is populism the primary element of the, I call it, traditional populist parties like SDA, HDZ, and SDS? Well, if we see populism as a logic and not a label, then the right question is whether those political parties constructing people through making antagonisms towards someone other. And they really did that in the 90s. They did it in order to construct political identities of those ethnic or national groups very well. And within the power sharing system, ethnic dominance became the primary logic not only of political life, but also of social life, pillarizing society across ethnic lines. And those ethnic political parties, they used to be and still are very closely tied to religious organizations. So together with that, and together with the fact that you have territorial and administrative division in the country that follows ethnic lines, you have entities that are having a lot of authority, a lot of sovereign authority that is given from the state to the entities, and the entities are ethnically very homogeneous. Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina is made up of 90-something% of Bosniaks and Croats. And Republika Srpska is made up also by 90-something% of Serbs. And that is a product of the war, of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And when you have very ethnically homogenized territories that also have administrative powers, and in power sharing, probably you are familiar with the pillars of consociational democracy defined by Arendt Leibhardt. One of those pillars is segmentative autonomy, meaning that ethnic groups have, in those power sharing system, consociational democracies, a degree of self-governance in matters that are important for their identity, like ethnic, religious, linguistic, national matters. So they are given to the ethnic groups to deal with them. So ethnic principle moved from merely representing groups to shaping their own collective identities. So that's the reason why I think that inter-ethnic populism is still stronger than cross-ethnic, because you have this moment, plus you have those mono-ethnic competition playing fields, where basically you can be a multi-ethnic political party, and you can try to address all the people living in the country, but the ethnic groups will not recognize you as somebody that they can give you their loyalty, because the political system is based like this. And Also, when you are socializing in a very divided society, you are unfortunately socializing along those ethnic lines. So what my solution is, probably not the best, or probably, I don't know, I'm still trying to come to the solution, is that the primary arena where democracy needs to be populistically established is within intra-ethnic groups. If you have competition between the old traditional ethno-politicians and their competitors that can also probably have different ideological perspective, unfortunately, nowadays they don't have. They are mostly leaning to the right. But that is the main playing field. And within this particular playing field, you can exercise democracy. And then I believe that if you have in all the three monoethnic subsystems, three political parties that are more liberal leaning or left leaning, it's more easier to share power in a constitutional democracy if you have this ideological similarity between those two groups. When you have three groups that are right-wing and sharing very different visions of the society and of the country as well, then it becomes really, really tricky. So that's also the reason why cross-ethnic construction of the people is lacking, because intra-ethnic dynamics is more stronger. So that's why I think that the pluralism is very needed into this intra-ethnic subsystems that it can emerge towards the wider society. I don't know whether I.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jasmine.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I think
Thank you.
did we plan to have the question and answer from the audience? No? We actually don't have time, I think, for that, right? Reka, do we have time or not? We should conclude.
Yes, we have 8 minutes.
8 minutes
So
for
yes, we have
questions. Yeah, so if somebody has questions. No?
Yeah, we can wrap up, Leila.
What?
We can wrap up the session.
Okay, yes, because they're okay. So is this Reka first or me who's wrap up the question, the session?
Oh, you can go ahead first. And I will finish
well, first of all, thank you so much for everyone who spoke today, and the reviewers and the audience. It was fascinating discussion, I think. We raised a lot of questions besides answering to some, which are quite key. It was a very enriching panel. I learned myself a lot, especially that by coincidence, I'm working on the issues similar to, so I'll have a chance to quote the participants here. So basically what we were discussing, that's populism is a symptom, it's a big sign of certain pressure or tension, of contradiction which exists, or something that should change. And this, first of all, is related to institutions which lag behind the challenges of developments in the society, in the world, in the politics and economics. We have seen here today the analysis of mechanisms of interaction between the society, politics, and institutions. So in some cases, we saw how institutional legacies affected construction of people's image, or what you call concept of we the people. And these legacies are actually being reproduced, as Jasmine Hasanovic said. We also saw the tension, potential tension between models of democracy, which was presented by Sixtine van Utrecht, which gives also very rich material in terms of its how the society is actually reproducing or producing the rules according to which democracy works, trying to go ahead or trying to compensate that is lagging behind of the traditional institutions of democracy. And this urgency of pressure is also caused by some factors, which were mentioned by Christopher Magno about like IT. We didn't speak about it much today, but I'm happy that he mentioned it. This urgency of the institutional reshaping, and what is important also that because of this cross-geographical comparison, we manage, as Amedeo mentioned, Variale, he stressed the commonalities and differences between the populism in the Eastern Europe, for instance, and Western Europe. I would extend it and say that we have very similar to what Jasmine Hasanovic said, the developments in the former Soviet Union, which is very similar, and exactly we prioritized there the emergence of the people's, first of all, power rather than representative now. So, and of course, very important, and I think it's very timely and close very important gap in the studies, Sanchez, Nieves, Cancela Sanchez, representation and inclusion in diplomacy. So let me just thank again the everyone. First of all, the institute who arranged it, the Center for Populism Studies, and Bülent Güneş and Reka Kolisar, everyone who helped to put that together. And of course, first of all, the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And on behalf of ECPS, I would also like to express our thanks for the distinguished presenters for your insightful and thought-provoking contributions. And I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to our chair for her thoughtful assessment and excellent moderation throughout the session, as well as our discussants for their precise and illuminating comments. And we would like to warmly invite you to join for the next ECPS virtual workshop, which will be on the 19th of March, so in 2 weeks, where the session will explore from bots to ballots, AI, populism, and the future of democratic participation. So it's also going to be a very interesting session. We encourage all of you to register and take part in this next conversation. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.